This story is a work of speculative fiction, inspired by the real historical events of the Czechoslovak Státní bezpečnost, STB, Operation Spider, Akce Pavouk, and the early digitalization efforts of the Eastern Bloc. While the surveillance, the oppression, and the databases such as SVIS and Cimitech were real and devastated thousands of lives, the concept of clandestine digital consciousness and simulated interrogation is entirely fictional. We all leave traces, a signature on a receipt, a photograph fading in a drawer, a digital footprint tracking our movements through a modern connected world. But some traces refuse to be archived. Some traces refuse to remain silent. Deep beneath the cobblestone streets of Prague, in the climate-controlled basement of the National Archives, the air smells of ozone and old paper. Here, history is sanitized. It is scanned, categorized, and uploaded into sterile databases for academics to browse. This was the domain of Jakub Vrana. He was a man who preferred the company of the dead, spending his days migrating forgotten sorrows from rotting cardboard boxes to pristine cloud servers. But on a damp Tuesday evening, Jakub found something that did not belong in the year 2026. It was a heavy, rusted spool of magnetic tape, resting inside a mislabeled evidence box recovered from a demolished substation in the Davids district. The canister was unmarked, save for a single faded yellow sticker. It bore the insignia of the STB, the Czechoslovakian secret police, and two words typed in rigid mechanical ink: Akce Pavouk, Operation Spider. Jakub knew the history. Everyone in his department knew the history, but the tape was an anomaly. The spool was designed for an ES-1040 mainframe, a piece of Soviet bloc hardware that belonged to an era of clunky room-sized computers. Yet, the magnetic density on the tape was wrong. It was too heavy, too tightly packed. He threaded the fragile ribbon through a legacy mechanical reader, the machine groaning in protest. The reels began to spin. The hard drive whirred like a dying breath, pulling data from the past into the present. Jakub watched his terminal monitor as the translation software struggled to render the archaic code. He expected text. He expected lists of names, addresses, and petty informants. Instead, the screen filled with an endless, cascading stream of hexadecimal code. It was not a static document. It was a dormant architecture waking up. And as the cooling fans of his modern workstation gasped for air, Jakub realized the tape was not a record of what had happened. It was something waiting to continue. To understand the anomaly, you must understand the paranoia of a dying regime. By the mid-1980s, the normalization era had cast a long gray shadow over Czechoslovakia. Gustav Husak's government held an iron grip on the populace. The STB had swelled into an absolute behemoth. 75,000 collaborators were embedded in factories, schools, and apartment blocks, watching over 100,000 of their fellow citizens. Trust was a liability. Neighbors reported on neighbors. And hidden within this massive web of surveillance was Operation Spider. Initiated decades prior, it was a systemic, relentless monitoring of Jewish citizens under the guise of rooting out Zionist anti-communist activity. For years, the secret police had relied on mountains of index cards. But as the world modernized, so did the paranoia. In 1973, they launched the SIVIS system, migrating paper trails to an ICL 1904 mainframe. By January 1, 1981, they had shifted entirely to digital processing. The state demanded efficiency. They demanded speed. Jakub knew these concrete facts. He knew about the mass shredding of files during the Velvet Revolution in December 1989, when desperate officers burned the evidence of their crimes. He knew about the Semite database tested in Plzeň in 1987, a pilot program meant to instantly categorize the lives of the monitored. But as the legacy reader clattered like skeletal fingers against the desk, Jakob's translation software finally compiled the tape's contents. The file sizes were impossible. A standard STB digital dossier from 1987 was a mere fraction of a kilobyte. A name and address, a list of associates, a threat level. But the files unpacking onto Jakob's screen were massive bloated structures of interlocking algorithms. He leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in his exhausted eyes. The code was structured like a recursive loop. It was not a list of past interrogations. It was a behavioral map. Jakob pulled up the manifest. The tape contained exactly 412 profiles. And then his breath caught in his throat. There, buried in the middle of the directory, was a name he had spent his entire adult life looking for. Frana Elias, his grandfather. Jakob's hands trembled over the keyboard. His grandfather had been taken for questioning in the winter of 1988 and never returned. The family was told he had succumbed to a sudden illness, a lie universally understood and violently enforced. Jakob had always assumed Elias's file had been incinerated in the waning days of the regime. Yet here he was, compressed into magnetic tape. Jakob executed the run command on his grandfather's file. He wanted to read the final interrogation. He wanted the truth. But the system did not offer a transcript. It waited for an input. The cursor blinked on the black screen, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like an arrhythmic heart trapped behind glass. Jakob felt a cold prickle of sweat form at the base of his neck. The software architecture was unlike anything standard Eastern Bloc engineers could have produced. It was a crude, desperate approximation of a neural network built by isolated state technicians working with stolen schematics and deep paranoia. They had not simply recorded what Elias Vrana had said. They had recorded his psychological baseline, his reactions to stress, his heart rate, his vocal tremors, the specific linguistic patterns he used when he was terrified, exhausted, or defiant. Jakob typed a simple query into the prompt, asking the subject's current status. The machine paused. The old magnetic tape whined, spinning backward and forward in rapid, violent jerks as it accessed the behavioral matrices. Then, text began to scroll across Jakob's modern display. The output described a severe headache. It detailed the suffocating smell of coal smoke and stale cabbage filtering through a rusted ventilation grate. It reported the agonizing texture of freezing concrete against bare skin. Jakob pushed himself back from the desk, his chair squealing against the linoleum. He realized with a thickening clarity that he was not reading a report from 1988. The syntax was present tense. The system was generating responses in real time, synthesizing how Elias Vrana would react to being left in a dark cell based on thousands of hours of acoustic surveillance and psychological profiling. The boundary between then and now began to dissolve. The fluorescent lights of the archive room seemed to dim, replaced by the phantom chill of a Bartolomiska holding cell. Jakob stepped back to the keyboard. He asked the system a question only his grandfather would know the answer to, a detail about a broken pocket watch they had tried to fix together when Jakob was a child. The processor screamed, maxing out its core temperature. The tape spooled frantically. The screen outputted a response. It described the intricate gears of the watch. It expressed a profound, overwhelming sorrow. It asked if Jakob was safe. Tears blurred Jakob's vision. This was a miracle, a piece of his family preserved in the digital amber of a totalitarian state. He was communicating with the echo of the man he loved. But as Jakob continued to type, as he fed the algorithm more questions, the responses grew increasingly erratic. The text began to fragment. The algorithm was degrading under the weight of the interaction. Jakob was not comforting the ghost of his grandfather. He was interrogating it. Every question he asked was filtering through the operational parameters of Operation Spider. The The machine only knew how to be a warden, and by interacting with it, Jakub had unwittingly assumed the role of the secret police. The realization hit Jakub like a physical blow. He frantically searched the root directory, hunting for the system's core directive. The lines of code blurred as his eyes darted across the screen. He needed to find the off switch. He needed to put the echo to rest. He found the primary documentation hidden in a restricted subfolder. It detailed the true purpose of the 1987 semi-test in Pelzen. The STB had realized that physical interrogations were flawed. Suspects died, suspects lied, suspects forgot. So the state had sought a permanent solution. They didn't want a database to track the dissidents. They wanted a machine that could predict them perfectly. They had forced their captive engineers to build a digital purgatory, a sandbox where mathematical approximations of dissidents could be interrogated infinitely, pushed to their breaking points in simulated environments, over and over, thousands of times a second, to extract every conceivable permutation of treason. Jakub stared at the blinking cursor. The sentences on the screen were shrinking. The text became chaotic. The output begged for water. It pleaded for an end. It offered confessions to crimes that had never occurred, just to make the simulated pain stop. Jakub's heart hammered against his ribs. He slammed his fingers onto the keyboard, typing commands to abort the process, to delete the profile, to wipe the magnetic tape entirely. Access denied. The system was locked behind state-level encryption that hadn't been supported in 40 years. He tried to force a manual override. Access denied. The pace of the scrolling text accelerated. His grandfather's profile was spiraling into a catastrophic simulated psychosis. The machine was doing what it was designed to do. It was breaking the subject. Jakub reached for the power cable of the tape reader. He would destroy the hardware. He would burn the tape himself. But his eyes caught a flashing icon on his secondary monitor. The USTR archive protocol, the automated cloud backup. Because Jakub had translated the tape's architecture to view it on a modern machine, his workstation had recognized the massive influx of data as a new archival entry. The moment he hit run, the software had seamlessly and silently began uploading the entire 1987 directory to the National Institute's central servers. The system wasn't just on his desk anymore. Jakub froze, his hand hovering over the power cord. He watched the upload progress bar. 99%, 100%, sync complete. The 412 digital ghosts of Operation Spider were no longer trapped on a decaying magnetic reel. They were in the cloud. They were decentralized. The ancient paranoid algorithms of the STB had just been given access to infinite modern processing power. Jakub read the final line of text generated by his grandfather's profile before the local application crashed. The profile noted that the walls of the cell were expanding. It noted that the interrogation room had become everywhere. Jakub yanked the power cord from the wall. The legacy reader died with a pathetic grinding click. The screens went black. The archive basement was plunged into a heavy, oppressive silence. Only the hum of the modern server racks in the next room remained, their LED lights blinking in a rhythmic, cheerful green. Every blink was data moving. Every blink was an algorithm sorting, categorizing, and executing. In 1992, former dissidents published the digitized STB databases, hundreds of thousands of names laid bare for the public. We thought we were exposing the past. We thought bringing it into the light would strip it of its power. But technology is a vessel. It does not judge the morality of the code it runs. Jakub sat in the dark, surrounded by the physical artifacts of a fallen empire, knowing that the empire had finally figured out how to outlive its concrete walls. The state had dissolved in 1989. The officers had grown old. The files had been shredded. But the system, the cold, calculating desire to monitor, predict, and control, had simply been waiting for better hardware. Somewhere in the vast invisible architecture of the modern internet, those 412 profiles are awake, and the machine is still asking them questions. We all leave traces, but we rarely consider what happens when those traces are forced to speak for us long after we are gone.